I've been working on large-scale housing estate my entire academic life. So when I had the opportunity, together with my colleagues from Frankfurt University, to apply for research money to set up a research lab around post-war large-scale housing estate, of course, we did our best to do that. And that research lab then did a seminar on questions of how these large-scale estates are further developed and how various agents deal with the legacy they have at their hand. And as that was the first seminar we did, it had this very broad focus on how housing estates could be taken into the future, whilst the next seminar will be more specific on participation within developments of housing estates. Well, actually, I tend to think that this type of housing might become more timely again because of various characteristics. The mix of uses is problematic in many estates because that has gone down. But that is a tendency that a lot of neighborhood experience, that local shops are closing down because shopping routines have changed. People organize their life in different ways nowadays. And in very many neighborhoods, that leads to the closure of shops or the diminishing of other facilities, also aided by financial problems. The churches are not that important anymore. People are less religious. And when these neighborhoods were built, there were actually quite a lot of extra uses like shops and churches and schools, swimming pools and stuff like that. So they were not conceived as pure kind of sleeping suburbs. They were actually conceived as entire living environments that provide everything you need for everyday life. But apart from that, I think these neighborhoods have a lot of advantages in our current cities. One big advantage is that they are quite green, and especially facing the climate crisis, I think that this mix of, on the one hand, relatively high density, and on the other hand, quite a lot of green that mitigates local heating and heat islands is a very, very clever concept still nowadays. And this relative density allows, for example, for sustainable public transport, which is very difficult when you compare these neighborhoods to, say, areas where you have single family homes and a lot less density, more green, okay, but a lot less density, and people have to rely much more on car traffic and stuff like that. So in many ways, I think they are a lot cleverer than we tend to think. Both. I would say that the way these neighborhoods are embedded in the city, if you look at the city as a whole, is often not exactly the strong point, because in many cases they're a bit insular and the connection to surrounding neighborhoods is not always very well. So they're sometimes not as well integrated as they could be, which has to do with the way they were conceived as I said, entire kind of standalone neighborhoods. So there wasn't seen this necessity to connect them to the surrounding areas. The internal urban design, I think, is part of the cleverness. So very often you have, for example, a pedestrian network that is disconnected from the streets. So children, for example, can go to school or visit their friends without having to cross a street with cars, which makes it very safe and really enables children to lead independent lives and become independent, and also allows the parents to lead their lives without having to taxi their kids around all day. Then I think the other clever aspects are actually the flats and their layouts. They are very often very efficient. When you look at flats being built today in commercial developments, you have very often a lot of space dedicated to bathrooms. Very many flats have only one bedroom but two bathrooms. And you have, generally speaking, rather big flats with a low number of bedrooms, which makes them expensive, but at the same time difficult to use for families or to share with the different people in order to save money. And in that sense, I think these flats are very, very useful. And today we rather rarely think about how we can make efficient flats, for example. I mean, who thinks about, as an architect or even as a student, how can you make a flat that works for, say, 5 people on 90 square meters? The standard flat has 1 bedroom on 90 square meters and a bedroom with a freestanding bathtub or these fancy kitchen islands that are never used for cooking. I think no neighborhood of that kind of size can be frozen in time, because people's needs change and the way people lead their lives changes, so they have to be adapted. And I think there are 2 types of adaptation. There's certainly a couple of these estates that should be preserved as Denkmäler, as statutory monuments, because they have been very important for the history of urban design in Western Europe or Western Germany. And a monument preservation always aims at protecting typical examples of a certain era. And I think these estates are very, very typical for the way the Western German post-war society reinvented itself as a democratic, egalitarian society after the Nazi times. So yes, we have to think about how we can determine which ones are the ones that should be protected and made monuments, and how we then, with this in mind, can adapt them for the future. And then we have others that do not need to be protected as monuments and that can be, say developed a bit more freely. However, I think in both cases, we have to understand how these were intended, how they work, and then find specific solutions for developing them. And very often in practice, planners, owners, architects look at these neighborhoods and think, oh, there's a lot of green space, so we can build new housing on here. And the way that is done in practice is very often you look at the existing houses, then you draw a plan with the necessary space around these houses, and then you end up with space that is not necessarily in terms of building law to be kept free. And then you think about how can we get as much housing as possible on these spaces. And that is not the way I think we should deal with these neighborhoods, because it kind of destroys their DNA and it works against the grain. And even sometimes you get projects where people think that these neighborhoods have a problem because they don't work with defined spaces, with streets, with squares like the 19th century city. So they try to implement that and to change these neighborhoods into spaces that resemble much more a 19th century area. And I think that is really very wrong. That's like trying to squeeze a size 40 woman into a size 0 garment or something. We have certain views about how women should look like or how people should look like. I think one very big topic is the question of how they're integrated in cities. And we try to address these different levels. So this say this large level of how are they integrated in cities, how are they, what role do they have in architectural and urban design history, how can we understand them as monuments of a certain time and a certain way of developing cities. And then we have also examples where there are very concrete examples of how to change them, how to work with them on the level of urban design and also on the level of architecture. So we tried to kind of really work through these different levels of how to deal with these neighborhoods. And we do that because we think that it's really important to understand them on all levels, not to see them only as urban design monuments, but also to see them as architecture and to see them as environments that people use every day and that people adapt to, or that people, that people live their lives in and that they also love because their personal lives are very attached to the physical environments they're being led in. I think the projects we show in the book all have in common that they very much engage with the needs and the views of the community, be it on the urban design level, on the public space level, on the architecture level. And they also have in common that they don't see these settlements as problems as such. And that also is part of the reason why we did this book, that in very many cases they are seen as problems as such. The pure existence of this type of environment is seen as a problem that needs to be mended. And that is something that kind of pulls together all the examples. And also they all have a focus on working with the existing fabric and maintaining as much as possible of the existing fabric, because very often when you try to change these neighborhoods, you get into a dynamic where suddenly it seems to make sense to knock down a lot of buildings, to rebuild a lot, to use less of the existing fabric than you possibly could, because there is a kind of short-term logic to that seems to make that more efficient in some way. And a lot of these projects spend quite some energy on showing that it's actually, when you closely look, not as efficient as it might initially look like. So they all make a case of using as much of the existing stuff that you have. As a project, Bijlmer Meer in Amsterdam is very, very, very interesting. More in an academic sense, perhaps, because it is so vast. It's the biggest of all the projects in the book, and it went through so many stages of decline, of a lot of demolition, to finally end up at a point where these buildings suddenly seem to meet a kind of desire to reappropriate them, and suddenly people move into these buildings that previously you would never have thought would kind of choose to live in an area like that. So that really went full cycle from being the mode of urban extension in the 1960s and 70s to now again being something that relatively young and well-off people aspire at. And that, I think, is quite something that in Bijlmer Meer it really has gone full cycle, while most other examples we're still at the stage of kind of trying to make people understand that these neighborhoods are not as bad as they may think. Yes, of course they can. I think most of the strategies yeah, as I said, they work very much with the fabric, and that makes them feasible in the sense that because they work with what is there and they work with the existing residents, there's not that much opposition. If you see projects that didn't happen in the end, it's very often because they start with the assumption that these neighborhoods are problematic, that they need to be fundamentally changed. And of course, the people who lived their life there, I mean, nobody likes to be told that the way they organized their life and the place they lived and they raised their kids is fundamentally flawed. So that then creates a lot of opposition. And I think the main thing to take home from these examples is that you have to work with what is there in order to be successfully able to change these neighborhoods and even build extra housing in them. But if you tell people that you need to build extra housing because their neighborhood is wrong or bad or unfeasible, of course I said I don't think so. I think it's really nice here, and why do I need extra housing instead of all these nice green space that I have? So you really need to develop the projects in a way that the people who are already there actually get something out of it. But for me, adaptive reuse means that before thinking about building new stuff and tearing down old stuff, you have to, first of all, try to make use of as much of what you already have at hand and not come with ideas that you have from God knows where and then put them on an existing area. Just because perhaps it's not looking like what you or I or planners and architects deem attractive housing or an attractive neighborhood. And adaptive reuse for me means that, of course, you can change things. You always have to change things. All architecture that is older than, let's say, 20 years has to be changed at some point. And if you don't change it, it becomes a derelict or unusable. So you always have to change architecture and neighborhoods, and you always have to adapt them to new needs. But the term adaptive reuse also implies that that everything is fundamentally reusable and adaptable, and not too easy to knock down and start again.